What would you do if you were the only person who looked like you in an entire classroom? If every stare felt like a judgment? If you knew people questioned your right to even be there, not because of anything you did, but because of your skin, your background, your quiet strength? This is not just a story about school bullying. This is a deeper look into how courage sometimes shows up in silence. How people who are pushed to the edge don't always snap. They rise. This story follows Amira Jones, a young black girl who stepped into a classroom where no one looked like her, and instead of folding, she faced fire with unshakable grace. And what happened next shocked everyone, not because she fought back, but because of how she did it and what it revealed about everyone else around her. We begin on a rainy Thursday, fourth period math class, the kind of day where everything feels heavy. The skies were gray, and so was the mood inside Miss Porter's classroom, a sea of slouched bodies, dull chatter, and half-finished homework. But when Amira walked in, the energy shifted not in words, but in a hush, like the sound before a storm. Amira didn't make eye contact. She didn't try to smile or wave. She walked slowly, purposefully toward the back of the room where she always sat, but even that quiet act was enough to make people shift in their seats. Not because she did anything wrong, but because being visibly different in a space that resents difference is often enough to trigger discomfort. I want to pause here and talk about that tension because in real life, so many students, especially students of color, carry this invisible burden, walking into rooms where they feel outnumbered, unseen, or worse, openly resented. And it's not always obvious bullying. It's subtle, stares, exclusion, whispering about your clothes, your hair, your accent. It builds over time like pressure in a pipe. And eventually it forces one of two things, collapse or courage. And Amira was already choosing the second option that day across the room. Chase Langston sat gripping a pencil, his jaw tight, his shoulders coiled like a spring. Now Chase was the kind of student you didn't mess with. He had a record of 3 suspensions, anger issues, and a reputation for fighting first and thinking. Never he was popular in that twisted way where fear masquerades as respect, the kind of kid whose shadow stretched longer than his actions deserved. But something about Amira triggered him. Maybe it was her calm. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch when he scowled at her. But more likely it was because deep down bullies sense who threatens their illusion of power and confidence in a quiet black girl didn't fit the story he wanted to tell. Miss Porter tried to carry on with the lesson, drawing fractions on the board and asking questions. No one answered, but the real lesson was happening behind her as Chase cracked his pencil in half, stood up and slowly walked toward the back of the room. Now let me tell you something about classrooms. Fear travels fast. You can feel it in the way students sit straighter, stop texting, or pretend to read even before a word is spoken. The scrape of his chair echoed like thunder. Miss Porter turned around startled, but she was too late to stop the show. Chase pointed at Amira, his voice sharp. "You don't belong here." The room went silent, and this was no misunderstanding. No teasing. This was a direct challenge, one meant to humiliate, intimidate, and isolate. Amira slowly looked up from her notebook, her expression unreadable, and simply said, "Sit down, Chase." Now I want you to hear that not in the words, but in the tone. Imagine the calm in the middle of chaos. Imagine not responding with fear, but with quiet command, because real strength rarely shouts. It doesn't need to. Chase, however, didn't like being told what to do, especially not by someone he didn't think belonged. He marched toward her, brushing past the teacher like she was furniture, yelling louder now, accusing her of being arrogant, of thinking she was better than everyone else, of not being one of them. He said things no student should ever say, and everyone watched frozen, but no one moved. Because that's what fear does, it paralyzes until someone decides it's time to shift the balance. Chase reached her desk yelling slurs, kicking the desk, demanding she answer, provoking her, trying to pull her from her seat. Then came the moment, the one everything turned on. As he raised his hand, she moved not out of panic, but precision. She ducked low, grabbed his wrist, twisted it, stepped behind him, and with one controlled motion, flipped him onto the floor. Hard, the room gasped. It wasn't just the takedown. It was how calm she was afterward. She picked up her chair, sat back down, and opened her notebook again, like nothing had happened. And that right there was the real shock. Not the flip, not the speed, but the poise. The refusal to entertain drama, to give in to rage. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to learn and survive, and that difference is everything in real life. We see similar moments caught on camera or not, where people, especially young women of color, are forced to stand their ground against systems or individuals built to suppress them. Think of Darnella Frazier, the teenager who filmed the murder of George Floyd. Not with violence, but with the courage to hold a camera steady when everything around her was falling apart. That kind of bravery doesn't come from nowhere. It's taught, lived, learned. Amira didn't need backup. She became her own shield. Chase lay on the floor, groaning as Miss Porter finally snapped back into motion, calling for security students. Began to clap one by one like a ripple building into thunder. Not because they liked violence, but because they witnessed something they didn't expect to see. Power turned inside out when security arrived. Chase tried to twist the story, but this time the teacher and the students were aligned. They had seen the truth, and they said so clearly, and that's important because silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but when bystanders speak truth can finally be louder than lies. The guards escorted Chase out, still shouting, still trying to spin the narrative, but no one followed him. No one supported him, not even his so-called friends Amira, meanwhile remained seated unmoved and unapologetic. But what would come next, she knew would be even harder because a single victory doesn't erase bias. It only exposes it, and that exposure is dangerous but also freeing. The silence that followed Chase's removal didn't feel empty. It felt alive, like a collective breath held too long. Finally exhaled, some students stared at Amira with wide eyes, others with something closer to admiration, and Miss Porter stood still at the front of the classroom, her voice slow measured when she finally said, "Turn to page 84. Her hand still shook just slightly as she picked up the dry erase marker. But Amira didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She was back in her seat, notebook open as if the moment had never happened. And that right there is what separates resilience from retaliation. Retaliation needs to be loud, but resilience just needs to continue. And continuing in a space designed to exclude you is sometimes the loudest thing of all. After class, she was called to the principal's office. But this wasn't the kind of call made in shame. This was the kind made in concern and curiosity. Principal Green was already standing behind his desk, tall with tired eyes, the kind of face that had seen too many disciplinary hearings, but not like this. He looked at her and asked flatly, "Are you all right?" Amira nodded. "Yes, sir." He paused his next question, more careful than the first. "Where did you learn to do that?" She gave a faint smile. "My dad's a Marine." He nodded slowly. That explains it. And that pause right there was loaded, because in those 4 words was the understanding that Amira was trained, not angry, skilled, not violent, prepared, not reactive. And in a world that too often sees young Black students, especially girls, as threats instead of thinkers, that distinction matters. Let's take a moment to talk about how often Black girls in schools are over-policed, underprotected, and mischaracterized, according to research from the National Black Women's Justice Institute. Black girls are 5 times more likely to be suspended than white girls, often for subjective things like attitude or defiance, when in reality they're navigating spaces that already view them with suspicion. This is why what happened next matters even more, because the system chose to protect Amira, not punish her. That day, Chase's actions were reviewed by security footage, verified by witnesses, and by the end of the school day, an announcement came over the intercom. Chase Langston has been suspended pending further investigation. The hallways erupted in whispers as students turned to look at Amira, not with scorn, but with a kind of reverent surprise. She had stood her ground, and the institution, for once, stood with her. But victory doesn't erase all enemies, and as we're about to see, another storm was brewing, one far more strategic than Chase's open rage the next day in math class. The air was oddly still, like the sky before a tornado. Amira took her usual seat, back row, window side, and watched as a new girl entered the room. Leather jacket, tight braids pulled back, boots clicking like drum beats. She walked not with hesitation but precision, and as soon as her eyes locked on Amira, the mood changed again. This girl didn't need to yell. Her presence said enough. She passed every open seat and sat in the row directly next to Amira without breaking eye contact, crossed her arms and said nothing. But her silence was heavy. It carried message and history and unfinished business. The girl's name was Brielle Carson, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because she was Chase's cousin, and she hadn't come for friends, she'd come for revenge, but not the kind you see in fights. This was psychological warfare. And let me pause here because in real life, most bullying doesn't come with fists. It comes with tone, with rumors, with deliberate isolation and coded language. And Brielle was fluent in all of it during class. She leaned over and whispered just loud enough for Amira to hear, "You made my cousin look weak, and now everyone's talking. You're not safe anymore." And that's when Amira understood the fight wasn't over. It had only changed form. Brielle was smarter than Chase, more composed, and that made her more dangerous. She didn't scream. She strategized the next period. Brielle followed Amira to history class, sitting just behind her, scribbling notes, loudly whispering things Amira couldn't quite hear, but felt in her spine. At lunch, she sat 2 tables away, flanked by 2 other girls, both dressed in black. Both silent but intense words spread fast. "She's here for Amira. Be careful, she's trouble." And here's the part many people don't understand about surviving schools like this for students like Amira. It's not just about academics, it's about psychological endurance, the ability to keep your shoulders straight and your eyes forward while navigating unspoken wars of power and identity. And then it happened, a video began circulating around school, a short clip edited from the day Chase attacked Amira, but cut in a way that made it look like she struck first. Someone had removed the beginning and added text saying, "Look what really happened." The caption twisted the truth, and the impact was immediate. Students whispered, teachers paused, glances returned to being suspicious. And here's the danger of narrative control. Once the lie spreads, it's hard to undo, and it mirrors real life again, like the Central Park Five, whose lives were destroyed by media framing and edited truth decades before justice came too late. Amira didn't panic. Instead, she walked straight to the principal's office again and said, "I need another meeting, but this time make sure there's a camera." And that's the kind of proactive courage people rarely see in young students, especially those who've already been isolated. She didn't just want to defend herself, she wanted the record set straight publicly and permanently. The next morning, Principal Green scheduled a school-wide assembly, student staff. Even some parents were present as he walked onto the stage and said, "There's been a lot of talk about what happened this week, some true, some not. So let's clear the air." He turned to a giant screen and played the unedited footage of the classroom the day of the incident. The real moment everyone saw: Chase yelling, threatening, swinging, and Amira only acting in self-defense. The crowd gasped silence, then thunderous applause, and in that sea of clapping hands, Brielle sat still, arms crossed, her eyes burning, but the narrative had been reclaimed, the Yoshio. Truth restored, and that matters, because when lies spread in silence, it's courage and clarity that disrupt them. After the assembly, the hallways felt different, not louder, just quieter in a better way. Like the tension had shifted into something closer to awareness. Like the school had blinked awake to what had really happened. Not just to Amira, but to itself, because when a place that's allowed cruelty suddenly acknowledges it, everything changes. The whispers weren't cruel now, they were curious. Some students avoided eye contact, unsure how to engage. Others nodded slightly. A subtle recognition that something had been broken and rebuilt. And Amira moved through it all, as she always had, back straight, shoulders steady. But this time it wasn't just survival, it was ownership of space. A refusal to shrink again. And that matters because occupying space unapologetically as a young black girl in a predominantly white school is itself a radical act. It says, "I exist, I belong, and you can't erase me without being noticed anymore." But not everyone embraced the new reality. Brielle was waiting by Amira's locker that afternoon, flanked by the same 2 silent girls dressed in matching black hoodies and gold hoop earrings. The hallway buzzed, but no one stepped in. Brielle spoke cold and low. "You think you're smart, you just embarrassed my whole family." Amira didn't flinch. They did that themselves, and here's where things get real, because confrontation doesn't always need fists. Sometimes the most cutting response is honesty. Brielle stepped closer, her voice sharp. "You don't belong here. You're just some charity case from the South Side pretending you're better." Amira calmly closed her locker, leaned in, and said, "You know what I am. I'm still here." And that answer was everything. It said more than any defense, it declared survival as resistance, existence as defiance. Brielle's jaw tightened, her face flushed red, and for a second it looked like she was about to swing her hand, rising slowly, tension crackling through the hallway. But before she could move, a firm hand caught her wrist. Officer Lane, the school resource officer, appeared calm but serious. "That's enough," he said. Students gasped. Teachers peeked out from classrooms. Phones were out again. Not for spectacle this time, but proof. Brielle pulled her arm back. "She started it. She spat no." Officer Lane said flatly, "We've reviewed the cameras. We know about the edited video and the harassment and the hallway stalking, and you're not the victim here." Principal Green arrived within minutes, already informed, and without hesitation he looked Brielle in the eye and said, "You'll be suspended for harassment and slander. Your parents have been notified." The crowd buzzed, but not with cruelty, with a sense that something just for once was working. That accountability had finally stepped in. Brielle's defiance cracked, and as she was led away, she didn't yell like Chase didn't rage. She just burned with a silence that told Amira this was not the end. It was enough for now, and here's where we take a moment to reflect, because this entire situation shows how systems that often fail students of color can sometimes, when challenged by courage and truth and undeniable evidence, do the right thing. It's not automatic, it's not easy, but it's possible. And in the real world, we've seen this pattern play out when students record teachers making racist remarks, and those clips spark conversations and even terminations, or when marginalized students demand changes in curriculum and actually win those changes. It starts small, always with someone willing to say, "I'm not moving," and Amira had done just that. The next day was quiet, at least on the surface. No more threats, no more edited videos, no more whispered warnings. But something new appeared on Amira's locker, a single note taped neatly. No name, just handwriting that said, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Signed half the class. And that piece of paper hit harder than applause, because it meant someone had seen her, really seen her, and felt permission to stand taller too. And that's the ripple effect of resistance. It never stops at one person. Courage shared multiplies the next week. Amira returned to her backseat window side, not because she was hiding, but because it was hers. She earned it. And now no one challenged that. Not even with a look. Instead, as she walked in, heads nodded slightly. Not in worship or fear, but in mutual respect. And that's more powerful than any cheer. Because in the end, the goal isn't fame, it's safety. The goal isn't revenge, it's dignity. And as Amira sat down, pulled out her notebook, and looked out the window, she wasn't thinking about the fights, the rumors, or the cameras. She was thinking about what came next, how to keep showing up, how to keep choosing calm over chaos and survival over silence. And that's the lesson, not just for students, but for anyone watching. This story, the world will always have bullies. They come in many forms and wear many faces. Some yell, some whisper, some use their fists, others use systems. But what they all count on is fear, on silence, on isolation, and what breaks, that is not louder noise, but steadier truth. Amira didn't flip Chase because she wanted to fight. She did it because she had no other choice. But when the moment passed, she didn't revel in it. She sat back down and returned to her work. And that is what real strength looks like. It's not in how loud you clap back, but in how confidently you move forward. And by doing that, she gave every quiet kid watching her permission to believe maybe they could do the same. And maybe that's how real change begins, not with noise, but with one girl who refused to disappear. There's something powerful about a quiet victory. The kind that doesn't need confetti or trophies. The kind that just lets you breathe again. And for Amira, that breath came slowly but fully. The morning after Brielle was suspended, she walked through the school doors, and for the first time since her first day, it didn't feel like walking into a war zone. It felt like walking into a place where she belonged, or at the very least had earned her space through patience, truth, and unshakable composure. And here's what many people get wrong about strength. It's not always loud or physical or cinematic. Sometimes it's showing up the next day, not to gloat, but to keep doing the work, to keep your head held high. Not out of pride, but because lowering it too long hurts your spine. Amira's story wasn't just about surviving bullies, it was about challenging a culture that allowed bullying to happen in the first place. And that's the part that's often harder to confront because it's easy to remove one bad acto. It's harder to confront why so many stood by or stayed silent. But after her assembly, after her refusal to break, people started paying attention differently. For instance, Mason, the kid who used to sit near Chase and laugh at his jokes, now walked up to Amira during lunch tray in hand, voice low and sincere. "Hey," he said, "I was wrong before about you." Amira didn't smile or forgive him instantly, but she nodded. "Thanks." And sometimes that's enough, because healing isn't always grand. It's a series of small, awkward redirections back toward decency. And this moment reminded me of real stories like that of James Meredith, the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi in 1962. The hate he endured was historic, but what mattered more was what happened years later when some of the same people who screamed at him apologized on camera. Not because time healed everything, but because time plus truth plus courage forced self-reflection. And Amira was triggering that same reflection in her school, slowly, one person at a time. And it wasn't just the students that changed Miss Porter. Her math teacher began to shift too, where once she seemed tense, unsure how to handle confrontations. Now she took a more active role, guiding discussions on respect and fairness, using moments in class to reinforce values that weren't in the textbook. It wasn't a revolution, but it was the start of something better, because good teaching isn't just equations or grammar. It's modeling how to handle difficult truths with grace and accountability. And speaking of truth, Principal Green made another announcement at the end of the week during morning assembly. It was short and simple but powerful. "We are a community," he said, "and communities protect each other. And when wrong is done, we don't ignore it. We confront it and we grow." And just like that, the message was sent not only to students, but to teachers, staff, and parents who may have questioned why the school had taken Amira's side. But it wasn't about sides, it was about facts and fairness. And once that principle is stated out loud, it's harder to walk it back, because culture change begins with clarity in leadership and support in action. And Amira, while still cautious, began to feel the shift in subtle ways. People said hi in the halls. Students she didn't know waved, teachers asked her opinion in class. More classmates sat near her at lunch or invited her to join their study groups. It wasn't perfect. She still got looks, still felt the pressure of being the only one who looked like her in many rooms, but she also felt something new. Respect not handed out as charity but earned by her unshaken stance. In the face of pressure, and here's the part of the story that many overlook, the after the story, the way trauma doesn't vanish just because justice was served. Amira still had moments where she tensed, walking past certain lockers, or felt anxiety hearing sudden footsteps behind her. Because healing doesn't move at the pace of headlines, it moves at the pace of the body. What helped her now was that she wasn't healing alone. People were noticing, asking, caring, and that shift is monumental in real life. We've seen this kind of change ripple across schools. After students speak out about racism or bullying in Seattle in 2021, students formed unity councils to advise principals on race relations. After a similar incident sparked media coverage in Chicago, a black middle schooler falsely accused of theft led to parent-led reform initiatives. These moments start with pain, but blossom into change when people stop looking away, and Amira's school was finally doing that. The following Monday, she returned to class and Miss Porter greeted her, not with caution, but with warmth. "Welcome back, Amira. We missed you." Her words were simple, but her tone was genuine, and the class nodded quietly in agreement. Amira smiled slightly, and for once, it didn't feel like a defense mechanism. It felt earned, and in that moment, everything clicked, because what Amira had really done was remind everyone that fear only rules when silence enables it, that truth is stronger than intimidation when spoken calmly and consistently, and that justice isn't just about removing the bad, but about nurturing the good in its place. And as the school week ended, something small but beautiful happened. The school counselor announced a new student-led initiative called Voices Unmuted, a support group for anyone who felt targeted, misunderstood, or silenced. The idea had come from a student anonymously, but everyone knew who sparked it. Amira never claimed it, never took the mic, but her influence was undeniable. She'd turned her pain into policy, her defense into a movement. And that is the greatest measure of strength, not the flip or the viral moment, but the legacy it leaves behind. And for everyone watching this story, it's a reminder that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's essential that being the only one doesn't mean being alone forever, that the courage to say no once can echo far beyond the hallway where it started. And as Amira sat once again by her favorite window notebook, open gaze steady, the school no longer felt like an obstacle course. It felt like something new, something almost like home. Sometimes the most lasting victories are the ones no one claps for, the ones that don't make headlines or get framed in hallway trophies, but reshape the quiet corners of a place, the ones that turn tension into trust, strangers into allies, and fear into quiet confidence. And that was the kind of victory Amira Jones walked with as the final bell rang on Friday. Her backpack slung over one shoulder, her steps relaxed for the first time in weeks. Outside, the school students laughed, gathered in circles, planned their weekends, but Amira took her usual route past the courtyard and around to the small tree-lined path where she could walk in peace. And what mattered most wasn't that people stared less. It was that the ones who looked now saw her not as an outsider or a problem or a story to mock, but as someone real, someone who earned their respect not by fighting harder, but by refusing to disappear. And this is what we forget so often in our rush to tell stories about justice. We talk about the big moments, the dramatic turning points, but we overlook what happens after the applause fades. How does a person rebuild themselves? How do they learn to smile again? Not because the world let them, but because they claimed joy anyway. And Amira was doing just that. She found herself smiling more easily now, not out of performance, but because she could, because the weight on her chest had lightened, even if just a little. And maybe most important of all, she had started talking to others. Really talking, not to defend or explain herself, but just to connect, to laugh with the girl who always sat alone in science class, or asked the boy with the hoodie and headphones what music he liked. And in those little exchanges, she started to see something more. Community real, not forced, not performative, but born of shared understanding. Because every school has more than one story, like Amira. Every school has kids carrying invisible burdens, waiting for permission to speak or just to be seen. When one of them stands up, the others take notice, not always loudly, not always immediately, but the ripple begins, and in this case, that ripple became a wave. The Voices Unmuted initiative gained traction quickly. Students started using it not just to report bullying, but to talk about microaggressions, subtle racism issues they were afraid to name before, because they thought no one would care. And now they knew someone would. And that change can't be measured on a test. It can't be ranked or monetized, but it matters more than any grade ever could. Amira began helping behind the scenes, not leading the meetings or giving speeches, but showing up quietly, listening, supporting, guiding new students who looked scared just like she once was. And this reminds me of the stories we don't hear enough. The ones like Marley Diaz, the young black girl who launched Amira 1000 Black Girl Books because she was tired of never seeing herself in school reading lists, or like Naomi Wadler, who at 11 years old gave a speech at the March for Our Lives to represent black girls whose stories are too often ignored. These girls didn't wait for permission, they created space. And that's what Amira was doing in her own way, not through protest, but persistence. Not through shouting, but presence, and that matters because culture doesn't shift overnight. It shifts when someone refuses to sit quietly in the corner, and slowly others follow. And for those watching this wondering what it means to really make change, it starts there, not with some viral moment, but with one voice saying this isn't right, and another saying me too, and another asking how can I help? And eventually the silence cracks and the truth gets louder. And when enough people hear it, they start to change not just their words, but their behavior, their assumptions, their choices. And that's how schools heal, how communities grow, how equity becomes more than a buzzword, it becomes practice. And as for Amira, she never became class president or team captain. She didn't need to. She became something more. She became the example people pointed to when someone new asked, do students really get treated fairly here? And the answer was slowly getting closer to yes because of her. And that brings us to the takeaway. the part of this story that lives beyond the classroom. What Amira showed us is that being different is not a weakness. It's often the clearest sign of strength that when people try to erase you, you have every right to become more visible, not for revenge, but for truth. And that silence is never neutral. It's a choice, and choosing to speak even when your voice shakes can change not only your life, but the entire atmosphere around you. This story may have started with a bully, but it ends with a builder. Someone who chose not to just defend herself, but to leave a better school behind than the one she entered. And maybe that's the kind of hero we should be talking about more. The ones who show up, who stay, who refuse to be erased, and who give others permission to do the same. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong, like you were outnumbered or unseen, remember this story. Remember Amira Jones, because she's not just a character. She's a mirror for all the moments you thought about giving up and chose not to. And that choice matters more than you'll ever know.